Everybody has a right. All those in power tend to limit the rights and freedoms of people. They always have. They do now. And this tendency will continue because by limiting people's rights, it is easier to rule them and to accomplish political aims, even noble ones. But parliaments and governments are not free to do whatever they wish. They are restricted by constitutions and by international conventions, which emerged after the Second World War, when the world realized how cruel even a democratically elected government can be towards its own citizens, and how it can be dangerous for citizens of other countries. Yet those in power fear public opinion. Who knows and understands his rights and who knows how to defend them is no longer helpless. All people are born free and equal in their dignity and rights. This unalienable and innate dignity of an individual, whatever its religious or philosophical justification, provides the foundations from which identical sets of freedoms and rights arise. What are human rights? Freedom. The only person who enjoyed the privilege of unlimited exercise of his rights and freedoms was Robinson Crusoe, and only until his man Friday turned up. We all live in the midst of others, and the limits on the exercise of our rights and freedoms is the exercise of rights and freedoms by others. Many times in history, not only individuals but also whole nations and races were deprived of their rights and personal freedom. Slavery sanctioned by law was only abolished in the 20th century. But freedom has always been a much discussed subject. Religions and philosophies stress the importance of a person's freedom of choice and the responsibility incurred from that choice, according to the principle that we should do not others what we do not like done to ourselves. But freedom of choice means also the ability to relinquish one's own rights for the benefit of others, in the name of friendship and love. None of the rights of men, let me put it this way, is an absolute right. The state is always able to restrict the exercise of freedom in the name of such special public interests as safety, order, and sometimes morality. But all such restrictions have to be introduced by statute and subjected to review. Particular cases have to be examined by independent courts. And there is one more thing which is most important. It is held that all such limitations have to be consistent with what is congruent with a progressive democratic state. Freedom is that situation in which one is not forced to do one thing or another, and the number of bans is rather limited, although very seldom it happens that a person enjoys the full freedom to do whatever he pleases. His freedom is limited by, say, penal law and other legal provisions. What is important here is that in a democratic state, such provisions are merely bans and not commands. Under communist rule, we led the life of slaves, restricted by unending bans. We were forced to enter the blind alley called the bright socialist future, and there was no other road we could take. It was the principle of all communist constitutions that the citizens' rights and freedoms were specified in the same chapter as their duties. This suggested the following arrangement. If you perform your duties, I, the state powers, will observe your rights. Actually, a person's specific rights and freedoms follow from his being human, from his humanity. Of course, a person also has specific duties with respect to his state. A failure in those duties will alter the state's function. A person guilty of such a failure is liable to be punished by state. This, however, is completely unrelated to that person's rights and freedoms. A person enjoys rights and freedoms as a human being and should perform his duties as a citizen. Putting all these in one and the same chapter suggests their interdependence. From childhood, we deal with state agencies and state officials such as teachers, the staff of state hospitals, officials who decide whether we get a flat or not, whether we get a telephone extension or not, what service we get when we come to pay the tax. All are the everyday situations, not to mention the exceptional ones, when the authorities start to suspect that we are into something illegal, when the police, public prosecutor's office and courts become involved in the matter. There are also the long hours spent waiting in the corridors of various offices, the hours that trample our dignity and destroy individualism and sense of value that is inherent in all of us. This way we are back to the underground just for a moment this time, I hope. What pushed people to the underground was the preparation for an armed struggle or struggle for the freedom of speech itself. Freedom of speech may well be seen as the most important of all freedoms. Besides being a value in itself, it also guarantees in a way the other rights and freedoms of man. If there is no more news reaching us from some part of the world, if the press has nothing to say, or the only news that does reach us is good and optimistic, displaying everything as fine and great, we can be sure that serious violations of the freedoms and rights of individuals have started there. If authorities could tell people where and when to manifest their opinions, most of the demonstrations that would make the authorities uncomfortable would be staged in the forest, with the people marching around a tree. One fundamental political right is the right to freely express one's opinions in public. This freedom should be protected by state. The people's opinions can be outrageous, offensive or alarming, but state authorities are obliged to guarantee safety to the participants of public demonstrations and to offer them the opportunity to put forward their true opinions. There is, however, a limit that cannot be transgressed. Whenever a person goes beyond it exhorting to violence, the state is allowed to intervene. A person's freedom of expression allows him to criticize politicians and state institutions such as the government or parliament. Politicians should not feel offended if their incompetence or peculiarities are pointed out. There is but one state institution whose authority is subject to special protection: the court. A state where the court is exposed to ridicule fails to guarantee effective protection of rights and freedoms to its citizens. If I find a legal provision wrong or immoral, I am free to infringe it in public. This is what Martin Luther King did, or Gandhi in India. They broke the law, but at the same time identified themselves with the state. Therefore, they did not evade the law. They let the authorities bring them before the court, and they accepted the decisions of that court. To respect law is among the fundamental duties of a person who identifies himself with the state in which he lives. Modern conceptions of individual rights and freedoms were shaped at the close of the 18th century in the United States and continental Europe. Going west, American settlers occupied new territories and settled there. The state performing only functions of internal and external territorial protection. Any other intervention in a citizen's life would have been infringement of his freedom. This was the birth of the conception of freedom from the state. A different conception was adopted in Europe, where there was not enough of land for people to decide independently about themselves. The people were subordinated to local landowners. Seeking justice, they approached the state to be their potential defender against the landowners' arbitrariness. This was the birth of a conception of freedom through state, shaped in France in the Declaration of Human and Civil Rights, where the right to happiness is granted to all persons, and the state is made responsible for the realization of that right. This latter conception is deeply rooted in our country. The evolution that is now in progress here relates precisely to this conception. Our task is to pass from the belief that the state owes us happiness to the notion that happiness is our own personal business and the state only has to enforce observance of the rules of the game on the road to that happiness. This is the main difference between the two conceptions of freedom from which emphasis on different human rights follows. The American conception puts stronger emphasis on political rights and freedoms, and the European one on the so-called economic and social rights. Freedom has been written on the banners of all revolutions. It is also mentioned by all kinds of politicians. But freedom is in fact a most difficult issue. Here in Poland, we grew up in what was actually a slave system. Freedom is a ban on state intervention in specific areas of our lives. If the state cannot intervene in those areas, it can neither hurt nor help us there. We have to take the risk ourselves, winning or losing. There is no one to decide for us. The exercise of freedom is most difficult, especially for the unaccustomed. What we have to do is simply to adjust, to learn how to exercise our freedom. A person's rights should involve the possibility of claims. If his rights or freedoms are violated by state, he should be given the chance to challenge the state and thus to force its observance of his rights and freedoms.